This week, Stewart Scott and Trey Herr from the Cyber Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council join us to talk about supply chain securities and policy. All that and more on this episode, Below the Surface. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Welcome to Below the Surface. It's episode number 36, being recorded for Wednesday, August 14th, 2024. I am your host, Paul Asadorian, joined by recovering from illness, Alan Alford is here with us. Alan, welcome.
Back from the COVID.
Yes. I'm so sorry you didn't get to go to Hacker Summer Camp this
I
year,
know.
dude.
I know.
Yeah, I told you that happened to me at ShmooCon, and, it is what it is, man. There's nothing you can do. You can join me like remotely from afar trying to enjoy Black Hat, DEF CON, B-sides, all that stuff. So let's see. Quick announcement. Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting eclipsium.com/go. There you will find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. Of course, if you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can sign up for a demo. All that on eclipsium.com/go. I would like to welcome our guests, Stewart and Trey from the Atlantic Council. I want to turn it over to you, gentlemen, to introduce yourselves and tell us about your roles at the Atlantic Council. We'll start with Stewart, since he's on my left on the screen in front of me.
Awesome. Yeah, Stewart Scott. I work at the Cyber Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council as an associate director, and I work on our software supply chain policy work. And we've done some cool reporting kind of right before and right after the SolarWinds incident. And we've also spun up some work on open source software supply chain security policy after that and around kind of log4j time.
Awesome. Trey.
Paul, Alan, thanks for having us on, gentlemen. We appreciate especially mid-con time. I think we're recording right around when summer camp is happening, so
Yes.
I know everybody's social calendar is tight. Yeah, I'm Trey Herr. I get to work with Stu Scott over at Cyber Statecraft. We do a fair amount of work on cybersecurity policy, trying to put the security research and security engineering communities together with the policy community, hopefully for better or at least minimizing of harm.
Yeah, it's interesting, Trey and Stewart. The when I researched a lot on supply chain security, right? It's one of the themes that we incorporate in this show. It's one of the themes and areas that we address here at Eclipsium. So I'm always interested in talking with people that are working in many different aspects of supply chain, specifically supply chain security. And I came across the Atlantic Council, and I was like, and both you guys kind of came up in like different kind of angles, presentations you had given, papers you've written. So I guess for our audience, let's start like, what is the Atlantic Council? What's its mission? Where's it based? And what do you guys do over there?
Yeah, sure. Happy to take this one. So the Council is a foreign policy and national security think tank that was founded in the 60s with the intent to support the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, basically to be the U.S. side sort of collection of visionaries and wonks thinking about transatlantic security, thinking about what the West was going to do with respect to defending itself against the Russians. After fall of the wall, the Council took on a broader remit, thinking through security and policy in Southeast Asia, thinking through climate resilience, thinking through health, trying to put all these different pieces in conversation with each other. So the team that we work on, the Cyber Statecraft Initiative, is part of the Council's tech programs that are working through security, technology, market behavior, and public policy as they intersect in the U.S. and in the rest of the world.
Awesome. So when you folks create largely the product that you're outputting, I should say, is research reports. But like, what goes into a typical research report, and what's its purpose?
Yeah, I can take a swing at that. We've got a couple kind of different models we played around with. I think the one that I always enjoy the most are where we're able to put together a cool data set. I think a good example is our broken trust report. Tried to pull together all the public reporting on software supply chain attacks. And both like having the data set as an artifact, but then the analysis of the data set as kind of the output is always very like, gratifying, and it's nice to not be kind of just relying on your own opinions, but to have something to point back to, especially where it lets you play around with kind of building typologies that do more work translating for policymakers a lot of technical aspects of in this case software supply chain security, than I think is like normally out there. But we also got some other kind of reporting where we'll work on just designing something in the policy space that can solve a problem that doesn't have like the normal features of a problem that policy is designed to solve. Some of our open source software work's a good example of that, where like, the kind of technical side of things is not too fundamentally different from any other kind of software and security issue, but the like ability for policy to actually shape open source software, is like dramatically different.
Mm.
And Trey, I'm sure you had a couple of other kind of interesting reports floating around as well. You might want to tag in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing that we are trying to hammer on is it's really hard to make public policy about technology without understanding something about technology. But it turns out that just walking a lot of engineers into a room and saying, fix the problem, also doesn't necessarily produce good public policy. So we're trying to sit at that intersection of,
Yeah.
hey, we do really good work in vulnerability discovery. We've thought through the intersection of hardware and software security, and we get how Congress works. And to put those kinds of people, those equities in a room. So I think to Stu's point, in addition to having data, the other thing we're trying to do is frame conversations and put communities together. So looking through our fellows network, thinking through the folks that we've engaged with, it's trying to work through people that have hands-on engineering experience, are actually building and operating, in some cases, large-scale technology systems, and then at the same time, folks with direct experience in the executive branch and foreign governments. And that's for us, like usually the sweet spot is a fun cocktail. Making all that work, keeping the cocktail in one place in one glass, very, very tricky, but it's a lot of fun.
And was SolarWinds the turning point where your focus turned to software supply chains?
So I'll admit for myself, I was at Microsoft prior to coming to the council. And one of the things that was really interesting working with the public policy team there was supply chain was in the air in a significant way for years. It was the thing a lot of the security engineering folks were talking to us about, sort of having us think through with respect to policy. What would a crisis response look like? How do we drive, better outcomes in the market? And so when Stu and I started working together at the council, it was one of the things that we wanted to spend a lot of time focusing on. And I'll let him talk about it, but basically just, hey, do we even understand how often this happens? Like what kinds of supply chain attacks are out there? What's the history of this space look like?
Yeah, I think as I recall, our first supply chain report came out, I think about 8 months before SolarWinds kind of hit the headlines. So like in some respects, good timing. But it was much more focused on just trying to lay out like a simplified explanation of what supply chain attacks were, and the different points along a supply chain that they could kind of insert themselves in, and what those different points might mean for policy. And so then after the SolarWinds stuff started appearing in the news cycle, we kind of frantically revived that work, added onto the data set, and started trying to pull much more kind of concrete policy conclusions out of it. So it was very much a hard transition from kind of explainer to, oh, you might have a problem here.
Mm.
Here's some like really in-depth background on what type of policy things you might want to look at after that.
Yeah, Alan, I think it tees up your question nicely about procurement regulations, which is based on something that Stewart shared with me in prep for this
Yeah,
interview,
yeah,
which I
yeah.
find
So
interesting too.
there's what, a bajillion procurement regulations out there already today, right? Um, how do we tap into those to get better cybersecurity? I mean, bottom line is we want better cybersecurity. Bottom line is we got a bajillion of them out there. How do we glue that without just inventing whole new layers of stuff? Or what's the solution there?
Yeah, so I think there's two answers to this. One is we really don't know because it is already so hard to figure out how to buy stuff for the federal government.
Mm.
But the more optimistic answer is it depends. And I think I'll turn to Stu on this in a second because I don't know that we have a good consensus understanding of what good cybersecurity actually looks like. And as we get into the weeds of trying to specify through procurement rules or through policy what the design of a system or the outcome of its operation needs to look like to be good or better, right? And becomes a very ambiguous space very quickly. So I think that's one of the areas that folks have struggled with, is to make those procurement regulations actually talk to good security outcomes. But that's Stu's side before, so I'll leave to him. The thing I would think through for us is how do we buy stuff that is better than, right, what we have now? How do we buy stuff that is compatible with our both risk threshold and risk tolerance and our security goals? And then how do we buy stuff that fits our security model? So I think this is an area where the federal government has struggled tremendously. A lot of organizations do, but one of the things we found in the SolarWinds instance was software that DoD is buying is being evaluated for security, is being tested, but it's on a once every couple of years cycle. So as you're pushing out updates on a monthly or even a quarterly cadence, all of those changes, all of that code base is not being caught by that review cycle. And there's a lot of situations like that in procurement where the mental model is I'm buying a widget and that widget is going to be X meters long and it's going to weigh this much and I'm going to buy that widget once every 10 years. Here in this space, as both you gentlemen know, right, we're talking about service consumption, radically different approach. So I think the idea that we could use the federal government's procurement power, this big fragmented ecosystem of people spending a lot of money to try to buy stuff to drive change in the market is reasonable, but the mechanics of how we actually make that happen become really, really tricky. And I think one of the leading parts of that is the like, what is a good security outcome piece? I'll kick to Stu.
Yeah, I think the one of the big things that stuck out to us during the kind of SolarWinds reporting was that the model of thinking through, is this product secure is a useful start, and I think there's innumerable miscontrols about what kind of secure features make a product more secure notionally. But there's a separate, like very software centric question of what does the actual vendor's security look like? Because to Trace points, as often as they touch that product over its kind of life cycle, those are similar kind of points for compromise that might not be captured by the usual like is the product safe rubric. And I know some of the recent stuff in I think it's the CMMC, the cyber maturity framework tries to look at like vendor security as part of that supply chain security question. But to Trace bigger point, I think about outcomes, we talked about this a bit in the pre-interview. Like as a data nerd, it's very frustrating to not have like really any sense of what what features of a product or what features of a vendor's security practices kind of empirically reduce bad outcomes. I think part of that is just like the distribution of how often bad things happen can boil down to like you got everything right except this one time and then you were compromised and you had 17,000 customers and that's going to cause like a pretty brutal blast radius and impact, and the scaling between kind of mistake and consequence is really really hard I think to dial into as you're trying to refine these different procurement practices, let alone all the kind of overlap between which agency is buying what for what purpose. So yeah, it's definitely like a messy space, but it's nice I think to see a little more kind of thought go into the full life cycle of the whatever the software acquired product is.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's a great point, Stu. When we evaluate vendors for their security practices and supply chain security practices, even to extend that, is they can miss one thing, like you said, like a CrowdStrike or a million different examples. I don't want to pick on CrowdStrike, right? But there's a million different examples where someone just got like one thing wrong or someone made a mistake and it slipped through. And then our knee jerk reaction is we need to create policies to prevent that from happening in the future. But as the landscape changes, that one thing that they miss is something different, tomorrow than it was yesterday. And that's challenging. That's why they need people like us to help shape these. And so my next question was like, are there policies in place in forms of laws and or guidelines or regulations that you guys really like to help drive cybersecurity in the supply chain area?
I'll call one out because it's been subject to a bunch of commentary. There was a war of words about 18 months ago because the SEC was trying to create an incident reporting scheme for publicly traded companies. Basically, you had to do what's called a de minimis notification, a very very minimal notification, if you experienced an event or compromise that had a material impact on the company's value. At the same time, DHS, operating under authority from a newly passed law from Congress, was trying to develop and is still trying to develop a much broader in scope but non-public incident notification regime under something called CERCIA. The SEC rule got set, signed, commented, and out about a year ago, and it's been the reason that we know about a number of major breaches, including one impacting Microsoft and the most recent impacting AT&T.
Mm-hmm.
So from that standpoint, from a supply chain standpoint, it's been a really effective tool, both to draw attention to firms that are struggling, but also to highlight incidents that need further investigation. one of the really,
Mhm.
I think, useful lines of discussion that came out of the AT&T breach was people asking, hey, is this something for, there's an investigative body that sits in DHS called the Cyber Safety Review Board, supposed to dig into complex failures in cybersecurity. A bunch of people asking, saying, hey, is this a good candidate for that body to look into? We would never have known to even ask that question if the AT&T breach was not made public. So it's not directly a supply chain regulatory mechanism, but it's a really useful way to pull up information about what might or might not be working in the supply chain space. I think that those SEC incident reporting rules to me are an absolute solid gold win, which is rare in this space.
Yeah, and who would have thought breach disclosure regulations would be would be so useful for us? Because I think we batted that idea around, years ago. That was a, breach disclosure. That was a huge hot topic years ago, right?
Yeah.
Stewart, like
Yeah.
we're playing a game like favorite, regulations that you have. It's so exciting, right?
I
I
don't know
mean,
if
it
it
is,
falls
but
under strictly regulation, but as a researcher, one thing I've really liked is the Cyber Safety Review Board. Like having some kind of body whose sole job it is to go in depth into incidents and kind of figure out what happened and track through not just kind of technical chain of events, but where they interacted with different policies or different regulations has been very cool. And would be really excited if kind of long term they continue to do that work and had some like there's tons of incidents I think that come to mind that people like always want to know more about, and where you can get a CISRIP report covering it rather than having to troll through like a dozen different Google results, is a pretty exciting thing. And I bet too that there are like some interesting ways you could play with their recommendation cycle to strengthen kind of the regulations that incidents seem to either notionally be covered by and fail to be protected against by. I think one of the things that came up in their kind of like founding and setup was the comparison to the NTSB, the National
mhm.
Transportation Safety Board. And they have like a very cool feedback loop between making direct recommendations and part of their recommendation cycle is like you have to respond as to why you did or didn't implement this recommendation if you're the FAA, for example. So getting kind of more insight into not just how different kind of controls might prevent an incident, but why different agencies either are like for or against those controls would be really cool. Getting kind of like more visibility basically into the policy gears.
Yeah, so that's a good summary of things that happen that are very positive, that we can build upon. And I think your next question was about like the future.
Yeah. So, okay. We've got a machine now that helps us uncover the bad things. We've got a machine that helps us analyze the policy versus those bad things and kind of retro haul. What did we do? What did we miss? What do we, where do we need to go? So that brings the $1 million question. Then we want to create policies and we want to create ultimately a more resilient national critical infrastructure. That's the bottom line, right? Like the goal of all this cybersecurity is to secure this stuff, right? Like we want to harden and protect that which matters. How do we craft new policy going forward to do this?
Yeah,
Million dollar question. Stu's
it's a
laughing
great
already.
question.
Yeah, it
I
is good.
I think we could say the $1 billion potentially even more. I would have maybe three ways to think about the answer to this question. One is going back to something that the first national cyber director, a gentleman by the name of Chris Inglis, wrote in Foreign Affairs, is to say, actually, in all the work that we're doing in cybersecurity, for the most part, our end state is not more secure stuff. Our end state is stuff we trust to use for the reason we bought it. Like security is good, but it's halfway down the road. Like we want to use the thing, we want to run the database, we want to actually be able to build this technology and do something with it. Security is a necessary but not sufficient end state in that conversation. And so I think that's something that, it's a good question, right? How do we get to a more resilient space? But one of the big motive laggers in the discussion in DC especially has been like, why? Right? Like we want something out of this. So connecting those two conversations becomes really important. The second is we got to have good people. Policy is people in a lot of ways, and we're fortunate that the last 10 years, cybersecurity has started to become a more serious, less weird niche technical thing, and more of a standard part of the policymaking process. But that's got to keep up, and it is building on the sacrifice of some folks who are making great money in industry to go in and do 2 years in the public policy space. We could give some. I think there's a number of specific names that have come out, especially working at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, thinking through those that have, and again, enough of a technical understanding to figure out what's possible and what needs to be prioritized, but who actually get in and invest to learn the policy space. There's a program I will shout out to anybody who's listening called Tech Congress. It's run by a gentleman named Travis Moore and a team. And Tech Congress will place folks with technical backgrounds as fellows in different congressional offices and committees for up to a year for relatively competitive salaries, especially for early career people. And a number of those Tech Congress fellows, after their 1 year stint, have actually been retained on by offices and by their committees. And they are like forming this nucleus of really capable staff and legislators thinking through how to drive good policy outcomes. So the second part of this is definitely people. Like we need folks willing, it's a classic aphorism, right? Decisions are made by those who show up, and getting involved in the policy process, whether it's a full-time fellowship role, signing on to an advisory committee, literally sending a letter to your congressman when you see, your congresswoman, when you see a vote come up or an issue come up that you're interested in, that stuff really does matter. It resonates. But the third part of this is, industry has a really significant role to play. And I think when we talk about resilience, we've got to talk about the cloud. And while there's some dimensions of the competition between especially Amazon, Microsoft, and Google that have been really positive in driving security outcomes, there are some that are not. And it is incumbent on those three providers in particular to take a position with respect policy that is not just we're open for business and you can tell us what to do and we might do it, but actively trying to drive positive outcomes, positive solutions. And sometimes that's exactly what happens from all three companies. You get really good proposals, you get solid engineering work, people coming in to answer questions. But sometimes you get the brushback pitch, and sometimes you get the like, hey, we're not open for business, don't bother us right now sign. And sometimes you get a lot of yakking about like innovation and who's going to defeat China and some other nonsense like that. So I think that's the other thing to me. The third leg of this is industry's got to show up not just once, not just twice, but consistently, because obviously they have a huge stake in this, and it can't be about Washington telling, the Valley or Boston or Texas or Austin what to do. It's got to be a conversation, and that's a two-party problem.
I'd add to like from my perspective, the question of how do we make ourselves more resilient immediately kind of prompts two follow-up questions, which is like how resilient is good enough, and how not resilient are we? And I like do not have answers for that in even kind of anecdotal form, let alone something empirical. So I think the kind of first step to getting toward solving that problem would be better characterizing it, and to double down on the Chris Inglis sites. He said something, and I'm going to paraphrase that like intuition is not good enough to kind of govern a complex system. And when you think about it, a lot of the policy that we see come off the backs of incident ultimately boils down to being driven by anecdote and intuition. So I like for me and it might just be a kind of deep data driven need, like having information about how many bad things happen, how bad they are, and where and why they happen is kind of a necessary start to a more kind of holistic version of cybersecurity policy. Which is not to say that the stuff that is intuition driven is bad. There's some like very obvious things that there should be more MFA is probably a good place to go. But being able to kind of track your actual progress, and prioritize things that are lagging or prioritize things that are cost effective, isn't going to happen if you don't have a good overview of what bad things have happened, and how bad they were. That hopefully that is not too much of a cop out, but I think Trey covered a bunch of the other angles
That's a
very
great
well.
answer. That's a
Yeah.
great answer.
No,
That's
and along those lines, I think it's interesting that there's an old adage in cybersecurity, right, that extends out into IT and leadership of any organization. That's like, well, why would anyone want to target me, right? I think largely we've addressed that. However, the things that keep me up at night are start with how do we define what's critical infrastructure? Because I think historically we've thought of critical infrastructure as oil and gas and the industrial control system aspect. But as we've seen in a lot of recent incidents, critical infrastructure, I think, for the US is far more wide and vast of a landscape. How do you folks design, let's start like, kind of taking a step back. How do you folks design or think about what is and define critical infrastructure for the US?
I could take a quick pass. I think the way that I think CISA defines it is the kind of like bucket category is things, sectors, entities that if they went down would cause a national security problem. And I think where it gets kind of increasingly complex is that there are definitely now a large number of entities and sectors that are plugged into things that we kind of traditionally recognize as critical infrastructure. They have that like industrial park feel of a an
Mhm.
oil refinery, say, but that by themselves it's hard to kind of justify that this like obscure office application is actually critical infrastructure.
Yeah.
And so I would bet that a significant kind of challenge to defining what counts as critical infrastructure is less in like the actual functions that it carries out and more in the kind of things it's connected to. And I would kind of love to see a bit more weighting around procurement decisions given to thinking about not like what the actual function of a device is, but what things you're going to plug it into and what kind of levels of trust that would require. To Trey's earlier point about being able to do the thing in a way that we trust. And I bet there are tons of examples. CrowdStrike being a good one of
Mhm.
it's doing some cybersecurity stuff important, but it's also plugged into all of your airport scheduling systems. So therefore,
Yeah,
it
the
is kind of trickled into
airlines
things.
are
Yeah.
it's amazing how fragile the airline industry is, but also how important it is to the operation of the country, right?
Mhm.
And not all the airlines were down during the CrowdStrike incident, but enough of them were impacted in a manner that it's not just people getting from A to B, it's goods getting from A to B, the whole thing. And there's a lot more examples, which that's the part that frightens me. Is if an adversary to our nation, right, would start strategically targeting these things, they could cause disruption in our country.
It's an interesting problem, So Stu made the point. CISA, I think it's back in like 2019, articulated these things called national critical functions,
Mm,
and it was an attempt to try and say, okay, we've got sectors, but the sectors need to support stuff, and it was pretty abstract in terms of what it was talking about. It wasn't necessarily that specific set of activities and dependencies that Stu's describing. So I think there's work to be done there. Um, but the other thing is just there are 16 critical infrastructure sectors. That is too many to have prioritized. And one of the consistent pieces of feedback you see people offer into USG, into the government, is fine that there are some that are more critical than others, but we really need to address infrastructure, which may not be critical to the country, but which is critical to regions, to communities, or to specific kinds of operation. An example, I 100% agree, is airline scheduling systems,
mm,
right? It's funny when you talk to commercial airline pilots and you hear about the complexity of the bidding system that it's involved in, how they actually get routes and times in specific slots. It's fascinating, but it's a lot of infrastructure that's got to keep operating. And as we see when it falls over, it
mm,
falls over in an ugly way. And I think that's the piece of this I might come back on and say, I don't care what you think is important. I need to know what's going to fail ugly. And what might fail ugly could be, basic quotidian commercial stuff that's just wired together in an uncomfortable way, isn't well maintained, or has an assumption about who's going to pick up the phone when something goes bad that actually hasn't been true for 25 years. That's an audit process that CISA, the White House, are starting to get their arms around and thinking through a national risk management plan and process,
mhm.
thinking about national exercises. But we are probably 5 to 8 years away from that being a regularized part of the policymaking situation. And so I think it is the right question to be asking, not just what's critical, but what else should we be caring about that is infrastructure. And I think it's been a slow battle to get there. So there's a ways to go, but
I like calling it the fail ugly evaluation process though, Trey. I love that. I love that term, right? Because it really paints a picture, right? Of you're not just failing, but the outcomes that happen because of that failure are the ugly part of it, right? And we've seen that in so many different incidents. You're going back to solar winds and so many incidents before that, right?
100%. And I think that's to your point. It's what we assume that is true that ain't right, and it's that kind of failure that we really want to try to avoid, not just the stuff that if it falls over has kind of immediate consequence in a space. I'd be curious to kick back to Stu though, because I think one of the things that his work around the outcomes gets into is how we specify how much failure we're okay with. That's a conversation we generally are not comfortable having
Mm,
as a country and especially as a
Mhm.
policy community, but it's a critical one. You see folks get out in front of the TV cameras after an incident, say, can never happen again, and we're going to respond, and we're going to retaliate. It's like, okay, maybe that was above the threshold, and it wasn't a failure we could tolerate. Possibly a lot of things went wrong, and a few things went right, and it's a lot better than it might have been. Right? Yes, the reactor melted down, but there was no release of radiation, and we were able to contain the situation. And so I think that's the other part of this conversation, going back to that outcomes piece, is how much is enough? Things are going to break. We know that to be true, right? How do we contain that? How do we manage it so it's tolerable failure?
Yeah, I'd add on to that like I think the way that the current CISA critical infrastructure buckets are built, they force you to think of sectors, and they force you to think of entities within those sectors. And that's like a useful part of the framing, but there are also kind of services that reach across sectors. There are kind of functions within those services that, even if it's not an identical thing in multiple versions of that service, it's the same architecture, the same problems. And so, if the kind of goal of defining critical infrastructure is to define things that, should they break, it would be very bad. The more simplified version, to Trey's point, is what kind of singular things, from service to company to sector, to basic kind of functioning gears. What of those things could fail and cause a significant amount of harm, or financial loss, or whatever your kind of metric for bad is. Um, and I think when you start thinking about it that way, it becomes easier to approach that kind of complexity piece of the different services kind of supporting each other, and does start forcing those kind of harder questions about what is too big of a failure. Starts forcing questions about prioritization. Like, there's not necessarily a single point of failure in the kind of hospital system, for example, but they're largely and often very under resourced in their kind of IT departments, and that becomes like a fail ugly state much more
Mm,
quickly than other sectors. So I think, yeah, that getting away from the kind of like just sector definition toward fails all at once thinking, is, I think, another interesting way to frame around it, and prompts up some of the more kind of immediate policy questions.
yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead, Alan.
I've got a question on that one too. This is interesting because Trey started with we already have too many categories that are quote unquote critical infrastructure. How do we get our arms around it? And I'm thinking of the second order dependencies, right? Like CrowdStrike, fall down, go boom. Airlines, fall down, go boom. I
Mm,
remember a few years ago, the entire eastern seaboard of Amazon went down. Rare, super rare. The big cloud guys, like they're hardly ever going to fail ugly, but every now and again you'll see a big swath of capability down. And that day at work, 90% of what I used was down because it turns out they use Amazon. And so
mhm.
fail ugly propagates, right? Like, as we're trying to say, we already have too many definitions. It's like, even if we narrow it down to one, well, that one has 8 second order problems associated with it, or 10 or 12 or 20. Like, how do we get our arms around all that?
I don't have a single, magic bullet answer. I think one thing that comes up to kind of speak more directly to that idea of resilience is thinking through where things are concentrated on single services or single providers, heavily. And it's not like a kind of market argument so much as like if you're dependent on one service and everyone is, that's an easy target. And I don't know if there are kind of great ways to mitigate that, but thinking more deliberately about those failover states, what do I do at work when my Amazon instances are all toast, is, I think, a more useful way of kind of moving from the kind of binary of like the bad thing happened or it didn't, to the broader spectrum of it happened, but we were able to mitigate in some instances. We were able to kind of continue services. I forget when, but a hospital near where I live was able to go over into kind of their like more manual and paper driven workflow while their systems were down for a bit.
Yeah, they have a name for that too, because my wife works at a hospital, and she said we're on, I forget the term that she used, and she's probably mad at me because we try and remember each other's terms from our respective industries, right? But she had a term for that, and she's like, "It doesn't mean we can't see patients, it means it's just gonna be a lot slower,"
Mhm.
right? And, like, where's that threshold of responsiveness where it,
Mhm,
like, it gets
mhm.
really bad? Is there other failures that could make that even slower, that start to really impact patient care?
Mhm.
Yeah,
And
that
so
kind.
the thing, just the thing with these certain industries, it's interesting as we talk about newer policies, right, which you folks are working on, that put us in a better state in the future, such as, like, vendors that supply technology to healthcare, which we've already, FDA has already made some great strides there. They have to be in a certain state of security or it can't be deployed into a hospital. That's great for moving forward. However, this country and globally, quite frankly, are reliant on technology that has already been deployed, some of which has been deployed like when we were much younger versions of ourselves, right? And how do we help certain industries kind of get over that hump of dealing with the legacy so we can get them in a better state with some of the policies we've created to help moving forward?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a question that organizations deal with. It's a question that groups of organizations like the federal government deal with. It's a question the market deals with.
Mm,
Um, One of the things we don't talk about enough, in addition to how ugly are we willing to fail, in policy is, are we willing to fund modernization and not novelty? Right? This is something like the Defense Department has often struggled with. Like, it's really cool and it's easy to get support to buy the sexy new airplane. It is hard to get funding to go back and modernize the 30-year-old piece of kit that
Yeah.
everybody actually uses and works and does the job, and then spend ton of money to train on it and actually get useful on it. So in this space, the federal government a couple of years ago created an IT modernization fund. And it's underfunded dramatically. It's on the order of $100 million. It needs to be probably in the $1 to $10 billion range. But it was an effort to address exactly this issue of, there are some legacy systems that we're dragging along that are almost indefensible at this point. Like, we literally cannot implement any modern security models or engineering approach around some of these databases. The IRS comes to mind as they're one of the popular offenders. The Postal Service has got some issues in this space as well. There was a discussion, and there was an initial very small proposal about trying to push a program like this for U.S. nationally, right? To basically create a mechanism to fund at the state level modernization of state and local governments, or those sort of kind of can't fail lifeline sector infrastructure, in a way to address exactly what you're talking about. The complement to this, though, and something I think that hasn't been talked about as much, is to shape the sort of assistance that DHS, CISA, and other bodies provide, especially at the state and local level, away from just rip and replace modernization and into in-place, in-situ mitigation, right? I get that you're running a 20-year-old endpoint. I can do a lot at the next step up at the network layer. I can do a lot in how I enforce permissions and user controls to make that thing less threatening to that network. I can't necessarily change the device. You're not going to buy a new MRI machine. So there is Windows XP running somewhere in your network. I'm not going to convince you to spend $3 million, but with $100,000, a collection of YubiKeys, and a little bit of discipline, I can make that thing a lot less harmful potentially to you if it does get popped.
Trey, it's really funny to use the MRI example, because my wife actually works in medical imaging and has
Okay.
since we were dating. I helped her studying through school, and I remember specifically she would tell me about, like, oh, there's a new MRI machine getting installed in the facility today, and she's like, it is an amazing operation to watch, because it's not just like any other piece of equipment that you can just bring into a building. Like, she's like, there is so much involved because it's a giant magnet. She's like, there's special tool. You can't just like bring any regular tool to go work on an MRI machine, right? She's like, special tools, procedures, cranes, the whole thing. So when we talk about it, it backs up your point, Trey, of rip and replace is not an option. And it's so true. And I don't think we talk enough about what other mitigation and controls can we put in place that extends the life of some of this legacy gear, because we're just not going to be able to rip and replace and be in a more secure state in any reasonable time frame.
Yeah, no, it's good to hear. I have to say, it's nice to get that illustration of just what bringing a giant magnet into a medical facility might do. But I think you're right on that point.
And 911 is interesting too. And locally here in Rhode Island, speaking of like infrastructure that is susceptible, the 911 infrastructure was impacted here in Rhode Island as a result of the CrowdStrike failure. And my wife was like, does 911 like run on Windows? I'm like, my guess, and I did an interview a long time ago about the development and implementation of 911 infrastructure. I'm like, there's a lot of resiliency in that system. My guess is the 911 operator was sitting behind a Windows PC that was impacted by CrowdStrike and couldn't do their job, right? So the call's probably fine and routed because there's a lot of resiliency there, but it gets down to that endpoint, and now we have to start thinking about how do we extend this resiliency to all the different areas that could be impacted in a service like 911.
Second order.
I'm curious Stu's take on this, because this is something that we talk about a fair amount when we get into resilience. Is like, resilience is expensive, right? And there are a number of people who've written on, like, you may end up spending more. So how do we drive that conversation back to procurement, right? Where you say, hey, Mr. Legislator, I have to spend 50% more to get a non-commodity off-the-shelf system, or to modify it such that it's going to be harder for me to maintain, but it's going to be much, much more reliable in the face of these kinds of mass casualty digital events, right? I will have something that's not going to fall over the same way as everybody else. And yeah, no, I think there has been some writing and some thought on this. I kicked Stu and the brain trust of the counting things initiative.
Yeah, no, I'm kind of pretty pessimistic on that front, to be honest. Like, the way I think we've generally seen incidents like that play out is, if you have the resilient system, you were fine, and so nobody noticed or cared, and it was probably really hard for you still to justify having spent on that. And I think that's where a lot of the kind of, put out the fire after it's already kind of smoldering policy timing comes in. Where like I think without kind of better, almost messaging around, what things were prevented by a resilient system, it's pretty hard to to make that argument compellingly. Yeah, no, even to your point about the kind of cloud failures, we did some tracking of I think it was like lightning strikes on data centers, if I'm correct,
Mhm.
where it turns out like that is still a problem, that lightning exists. But where they don't cause massive kind of system outages, it's you simply don't hear about them off of like the most obscure kind of blogs possible.
Right, right.
And yeah, I think again, without getting kind of to the root, like how much bad stuff has happened, and how much of a bucket can you draw around bad things that a certain type of not just like specific system, but approach to engineering and resilience across like interconnected systems. It's not going to be an easy kind of sell. It sounds very nice, and then you'll either never see the results, or you'll see the results and it'll look like you wasted the money.
Right.
Mm.
Before I was in security, I was in IT, and the running joke used to be, "Oh yeah, I was sitting there at my desk as the IT manager, and the phone rang, and it was a user just saying, 'Hey, I wanted to thank you. We've been up for 119 days, and I just wanted to say you guys are swell.'" You know, that phone call never happens, but the second it's down, the phone call comes in, right? So it's the old out of sight, out of mind. If it's up and running, well, why did we waste all that money? It was up and running. Like it's the hardest sell in the world, resilience. It really is sometimes.
Al, I
Yeah, and
promise
that's
I'm going to
why
email our IT guy right after we get off this call and say, hey,
right?
things haven't
Hey,
broken in a couple weeks. We really appreciate it.
Yep,
everyone
you
take a
guys are
moment and
awesome.
thank your IT guy, right?
Yeah.
But that ties into, national policy is that I think historically, and you guys will probably agree, that they're largely reactive, right? I mean, we've already talked about how the SolarWinds thing happened and it was reactive. Like, what policies can we put in place that we don't have? I don't want to wait until there's another outage. I want policies in place that are going to prevent the bad things from happening. And that's a much tougher sell, as we've already described, right?
Yeah, look, I mean, Washington thrives on chaos. It thrives on
Mm.
crisis,
Hmm.
and it is not a party thing. It's not an institutional thing. It is just the
It's a
nature of
never let a good crisis go to waste, right?
right,
And that's both a
right.
political thing, and it doesn't matter what organization you work in, you're going to be like, well, I want the thing that I wanted. Now I've got a good crisis I can build on.
Now we got a motivator.
Mm.
Moving people in institutions that are designed to create steady state policy is very, very difficult. Change is, by its nature, difficult. It's hard in this space. So, how do we get ahead of the curve? There's at least two things. One is create channels for crisis to happen and for us to respond to them. Right. One of the things that was really interesting about SolarWinds, and Stu made this recommendation in the report that you guys talked about, is create an entity that's allowed to drive change, dictate change in policy around cybersecurity for just the federal government, and allow it to be default implemented. And so if agencies want to come back and appeal and say, no, we don't like this, maybe their appeal will get heard, but it'll be the appeal that's subject to the time limits and time constraints rather than
Mm.
the initial proposal. The DoD, Defense Digital Service did this a couple of years ago, and it was, at a low level, it was really powerful to drive policy change and compliance inside. And eventually it was sort of targeted and denuded. But that is one way to think about this. Is like, what are the mechanisms you're creating, not to solve the problem, but basically to create the capacity for change when that crisis comes along, capture that energy and actually turn it into something useful. Um, the other piece of this, though, is how to streamline these kinds of processes. There are, and I know the industry folks have very reasonable beef here. There are so many advisory committees. There are so many different bodies that have different pieces of the problem. I think there was a study that came out a couple of years ago that said there's 138 different committees or subcommittees that have jurisdiction over cybersecurity in some way in Congress. That is an unworkably
Mm.
complex space. And so, if we can't address the complexity of the technology and we can't really change the fundamental parameters of the security problem, how can we take the thing we do have a little bit more control over, which is the policymaking process, and streamline it down and shrink it down so there is less to have to work through every time we do want to try to move the ball? And if you're industry, one of the things that's a challenge for us is like we tend to hear from 30 or 40 of the same companies, right? To back to that point of like stuff fails down the line. It may not be somebody, may not be an entity that's even thinking about the policy process. If you can lower that barrier to entry and allow somebody who's running a 30-person threat intelligence firm or is building an interesting widget, maybe a security development platform for IoT systems, give them an opportunity to have even a small voice in those kinds of conversations so that it's 400 firms instead of 40. That totally changes the ecosystem as well. And it brings much more current and much more user-facing concerns into the policy process, which is what those bodies are set up to do. It's what those advisory committees are built for. So trying to create channels and simplifying, I think, are the two things that jump out to me, but I'm curious.
Yeah, I'd
Stu's
add
side on it.
too, and I think it's to policymakers' credit. Like recently, I think you've seen kind of two trends in that reactivity cycle. One is, there's definitely a broader kind of set of policies considered after incident. The reaction to SolarWinds wasn't fix your update servers. It was, here's an entire executive order about everything supply chain and software related we can think of. And so that broadening is useful, and it's also useful to see it happen not kind of at the instance of incident, but farther up in the design chain. So I think the national cybersecurity strategy talks about this, about better designed products. The Secure by Design initiative at CISA talks about this, and there's still a lot of kind of execution work in thinking through those. But it's pretty encouraging, whether or not you really enjoy memory safety, to see policymakers considering something kind of that far upstream and that like nerdy and technical. Because I think it's to your earlier points about kind of second order effects. The closer you get to those like core nodes of risk, the better the impact of the policy. And I think often you could probably argue the more kind of cost efficacy in that policy. So it's the one there's definitely that tendency toward upstream and deep in the weeds policy. I think it's just got kind of a long ways to go and actually getting executed.
Can I add one other thing?
Sure.
We in policy don't talk enough about architecture, right? Now, you guys sit in this space and you know it, right? What you can do at the root that a system isn't capable of doing, right? Will never produce a certain kind of fault is so much cheaper than trying to make sure you don't create the condition that leads to the
Right.
fault at 1,000 different endpoints. We talk a lot about response. We talk some about proactive design choices, but we talk very little about architecture. And again, not to hammer on it, but one of the reasons we talk a lot, at least we talk a lot about cloud, is they are the architects and the architecture of choice for the majority of these other technology systems. And so the other way to potentially get ahead of this curve is just do a very hard rack and stack on the efficiency of where in the different points of the ecosystem can you put policy, assuming you only get a few choices that are going to give you maximum input. And when you go back down to that root of where the technology and which other things are being built is actually being designed, is being whiteboarded, that has a tremendous amount of impact, even though you don't have the ability to do all kinds of what we might think of as public policy things. It's not necessarily going to be influencing how people buy it, not necessarily going to be influencing how people sell it, but the constraints around how it functions and the constraints around how it's allowed to talk to other kinds of technology. That's the game show. And I think we'll never get there, but moving a little more in that direction would help everybody out.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting. I think the EU is kind of led policy in the it's got to be secure before you buy it. Kind of function. We've seen that in the EU CRA. We've seen that in a couple of other countries that require vendors to produce a more secure product and has to be validated against a security standard before it can be implemented by the government. We in the US have some of those regulations in place today, and not all of them are necessarily enforceable. It's more guidance. Can we borrow some of the EU legislation and use that as a model to push the US government to pass legislation that says has to be in somewhat of a secure state when we procure it, right?
Yeah, this is a live topic right now. This is by the part of the reason we're smiling. The Cyber Resilience Act did some interesting things with respect, right, trying to move the conversation about who was obligated to do what before something came to market. But it also left a lot of, I think, kind of ugliness and some tread marks, especially in the open source community, right,
Yeah,
who were
they were
forced
they
into
were
this
not
box.
happy.
Yeah, like you're commercial or you're not. Like it created some
Mhm.
binaries that weren't really true of a lot of the technology ecosystem. So CRA, some good marks, some in terms of trying to move the conversation, maybe some bad marks in execution. There is a CISA initiative at DHS, something called the Secure by Design initiative. That's
Mhm.
a couple of intrepid folks who have been trying to articulate a set of principles by which companies should be designing technology. It's totally without any enforcement structure whatsoever,
Right.
and it is relying every year we see kind of more of an emphasis on potentially what consumers are going to need to step up and do on their own. without a lot of effort to really organize them or create the kind of focal point that they can speak to. Um, so I don't know. I'll give you one other example. There's a discussion about this with respect to IoT, and actually the FCC, kind of
Hmm.
an odd place, but sort of weird bureaucratic baseball as to how it landed there. The IoT is launching an IoT security certification program, and it's voluntary. And it's sort
Right.
of a like, we've got some principles and we'll figure out what the standards are at some point, we're gonna get there. And this is something that people have been talking about for 3 years, and it had tremendous amount of executive buy-in from a number of senior officials, both at agency and administration level, who knew what kind of a problem, for example, compromised routers could pose.
Hmm.
And so there's a lot of machinery to push these kinds of processes through. And I think I at least am not optimistic at the moment that you're going to see a regime that says, hey, you've got to build differently and you got to build in this way come soon. I do think that whomever the next team is, right, the next administration that comes in, is going to have an opportunity to say, you know what, we've got a national cyber strategy from a couple of years ago that says the market is a huge driver of security. And we've got a number of policies and offices that are starting to try and think about the design of technology relating to the security of users and security of organizations. We can build on that. We can get a lot more out of those muscles that have been created that may get moved in some good coordination. But we all got to agree this is not a solved problem. This is incredibly hard. And then what we've
Hmm.
done so far is just scratching the surface. And I think those admitting those to ourselves outside of the crisis, sometimes that's
Yeah.
tough.
No, I
Yeah,
agree. And there's been so many initiatives, right, that have tried to improve the security of IoT. I've seen so many different FTC has had some initiatives as
Yeah.
well, right? And
Yeah.
you're right. We're still in the same state that we were 10 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever.
yeah. I think
Stu's smiling.
to Trey's point about the market, the thing I wanted to chime in on was like it would be really cool to have a checklist of all the things you must build into your product before you can sell it. I think though the kind of notably different feature of of the not market failure but market challenge for cybersecurity is that it's an adversarial environment. So kind of by definition, that checklist will be out of date at some point, probably
Yep.
quite soon. And like frankly, government is not the one to be routinely updating a very technical checklist that immediately impacts kind of product requirements. So to Trey's point earlier about the national cybersecurity strategy, where it does focus in on incentives to build the thing well rather than a roadmap for how to build the thing well, that's
Yep.
I think a kind of more promising approach, but also one that's like pretty untrod ground for government with regards the IT sector. So yeah, similar answer. Don't have a great answer, but there's there's some space in between government tells you how to build it and nobody's going to tell you anything or hold you accountable, that is likely more efficient, and probably easier to actually write up.
Yeah.
There's
Alan?
there's a government model I've seen that may actually scale here, that might actually be useful to us, and it actually solves several of the problems we've talked about in this conversation. So, are you guys familiar with the DISA STIGs? If I want to sell to the DoD and I have a technology product, let's say whatever, it's my Roadcaster podcast deck I'm sitting here looking at, right? I bring my podcast deck to the table. They want to know what version it is, what technologies are in it, and they have a STIG, a secure technical implementation guide on sort of a per technology swath basis. So is it network connected? There's a network STIG. Does it have, some kind of video conferencing technology? There's a video conferencing STIG, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they will layer a stack of STIGs up against whatever my product is. They will evaluate it. So that kind of almost speaks to that architecture conversation we had earlier, where just by crafting as new technologies arise, you craft new STIGs to cover that new swath of technology, and in your architecture, if you will, is basically these 7 STIGs apply, and that's my architecture kind of statement, right? And then to the earlier point we made about version locking, right? The way the whole process over there works is I have certified version 10B. If I want to bring 10C to the market, guess what? I'm back on the bench and I'm back against a new list of STIGs. They're going to reevaluate what applies, reattach it, redo it, and on it goes. And I've been through this process before. I was with a company that manufactured technology components, and I was over the JIT putting my stuff on the bench and finding out what STIGs I was up against and going through that process. And we had a commitment as a vendor to lock in place, this version will not change based on this certification. If we do change, we come back to the bench, and I found it to be a pretty useful model, and I just wonder if we can't scale that more, you know?
It's an interesting question. So actually, I came across the SIGs a number of years ago doing some work for an entity working with the Corps of Engineers. And
Mhm.
one of the things that we struggled with was the states were very good, to your point, where they knew or could conceive of the technology that was in place and roughly how it was supposed to talk to other stuff. And in the OT environment, that got tricky really fast, mostly because there were a lot of control system and safety system endpoints that confused the tool set.
Mhm.
And so I think there's two pieces of that that become really interesting and useful. Like one, yes, an automated check, basically a configuration or design criteria, things like that. That is helpful. And there's actually a program, Secure Cloud something compliance, basically it's called Scuba, that's intended to provide a compliance check form like that to enterprises across the USG to say, hey, if you've got Azure set up, if you've got GCP set up, you've got AWS set up, you should be configured in this way. This is your default, and unless you have a
Yep.
business case, don't mess with these things, right? Because this is the
Yep.
consequences. 100% agree with you on that. The other thing we've got to be able to do though is, and I think we came back to this conversation earlier, make sure that those, whether it's STIG or whether it's another program, are updated in a way that matches
Yes.
the technology.
Yes. They have
And
to keep pace, right?
yeah, and where you've got people doing daily drops, that's probably not feasible. So what is it NIST or somebody else saying, what's the smart conversation about what the acceptable lag time is to make sure that these things are useful? And I think with the STIG, if it was, I can't remember if this is like an annual or a multi-year kind of renewal cycle, but probably having to pull that way down weekly, monthly,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is, maybe feasible, but certainly a big lift. So it's an
Yeah.
interesting idea for sure.
Other than writing our Congress people, what can we do in cybersecurity to help with these initiatives and tackle these problems that we've outlined today?
Yeah. So anybody who's at DEF CON next year, probably, go check out the Policy Village. Same thing for Black Hat. Spot the Fed is like a thing of the past. They are
Yeah.
everywhere. They're in uniform and they're not. They're in suits and they're not. CIS, I think, is sending more than 100 people to Vegas this year, and not just for the craps tables. One of the things that I think we see as a constant challenge for folks is like, who do I call? To your point, who do I get
Mhm.
engaged with? A lot of these are govies showing up at cons. There were folks at ShmooCon as the sort of Shmoo community moves into other spaces. It's the dearly departed. They're going to be in some of those spaces as well. So seek out. If you're at a con, see if there's a CISA table. See if there's a if NSA or others have come to be part of that conversation. I think that's one thing. But the other is, and I know this sounds a little insane, but check out USA Jobs. I very rarely give this advice because it's a pretty clunky piece of infrastructure, but it is the single point where all federal jobs, internship opportunities, fellowship opportunities gets posted, and just program in some alerts, and you will see, I think, a lot of stuff come across that might be of interest, whether it's an FTE role or it's a temporary fellowship. But that is a tangible way to get in the mix and get in the know. And the other thing, honestly, is just reach out to folks like us. If you hear us on a podcast, or you see people from other programs that are trying to do this kind of linking, looking at entities like Tech Congress, reach out. Even if it's not for you, doesn't necessarily feel like it's the right time, get into a conversation and learn a little bit about what these pathways into government or in interacting with government look like. There's all kinds of stuff that comes from those sorts of networks that's not, I'm becoming a full-time government employee, and I had a chance to sit at a round table and shape the conversation, and that's fantastic if it can happen.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great advice. I
Yeah.
think a lot of times we see those tables at conferences, right? And we're like, oh, I want to go do something else or, do a CTF or something. But
Run.
spend some time. Ask folks what they're working on at the CISA tables, the NSA tables, right? Yeah, I think it's great advice. Stu?
Yeah, no, I double tap the last one. We're not engineers, so it's always very, very nice when an actual engineer tells us how things work. And we're happy to try to return the favor on the policy side of things.
Yeah, Stu was asking me a lot of great questions. It was like a reverse interview when we were prepping for this. So, you folks feel free to reach out if you need advice or information on a certain thing, especially if it's firmware and supply chain. That's what we do here at Eclipsium. So, feel free to reach out. Stu and Trey, thank you so much for appearing on Below the Surface today. Alan, thanks for joining. Still a little under the weather and managed to push through. Thanks for that. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching, and we'll see you next time.